good morning, good afternoon, or good evening as it applies, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Brown School's Director of Professional Development. I want to thank and acknowledge my friend and colleague, Cynthia Williams, the Brown School's Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships, who's also here with me to support today's event. We want to welcome folks joining us on the Zoom webinar. As you likely are aware, we cannot see or hear members of the audience. We also cannot call on raised hands, but the chat feature is enabled and there will be time for your questions as the program goes. So please do feel free to throw in questions or comments at any time during the presentation today. We want to extend a welcome to anyone joining on the YouTube live stream or perhaps watching this recording later. We're delighted you're with us and also want to let you know that we're not able to moderate Q&A through YouTube. So before we get started today, I just want to let you know a couple things coming up on Open Classroom. We do multiple programs every week and they are free and open to absolutely everybody. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a longtime participant, welcome back. We will be doing another program on Thursday of this week. That's November the 18th. We have a program entitled A Social Work Perspective on Immigration Reform. It's a panel conversation offered in partnership with the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. And then the other thing that I'm going to flag for you is the next event in this Africa Speaks series will be on December 7th. We're going to hear from Dr. Lumbe Mwamba, who's from Zambia. She's going to deliver a presentation on sport for development, empowering individuals and communities in Africa. So I would love to have you come back for that or anything else. But now it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to Kurt Dirks, our Vice Chancellor for International Affairs. He's also Director of McDonnell International Scholars Academy, the Bank of America Professor of Leadership. Kurt, please take us away.
Thank you, Janet. And thank you for always doing such a great job of hosting these sessions and setting them up. They are successful because of your work. So thank you. To everyone in the audience, welcome to all the scholars who are here who have an interest in Africa. Here at WashU, obviously we place a lot of value on Africa as an opportunity for collaborative research and education. I know, as many of you know, we have a large number of faculty doing work on the continent on a range of issues, whether that's social development, health, climate change, economic development, the humanities, and many other areas. And obviously, we know that this work holds lessons for Africa, but also that we learn from it as well here in St. Louis and many other parts. And so that is one of the reasons why we value this work so much. It enriches us all and enriches our knowledge. Over the past several years, we have sought ways to find ways to promote that collaboration between WashU faculty in Africa. And the Africa Speaks series has been one of the ways which we've tried to spotlight experts on the continent and to learn from them. And it allows us and the many graduate students who are interested in Africa or from Africa to be able to develop those collaborations. And so we appreciate this opportunity and to do that and for you to join us with that. We have a faculty host for each of these, a WashU faculty host. And today's host is Professor Mungai Montoya, and he is a teaching professor in Africa and African American Studies. His work is on the social and linguistic changes that take place in multilingual African countries. And Mungai, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being our host today.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks to the African Initiative and to Kat and Janet and everybody else for making this possible. It's my great pleasure to introduce a distinguished scholar, a researcher, author, and translation consultant. Professor Iribe Mwangi is an associate professor, chairman of the Department of Kiswahili at the University of Nairobi, and a Carnegie African Diaspora Fellow. He holds BA, MA, and PhD degrees in Kiswahili and linguistics, with specialization in Kiswahili phonology, morphology, and social linguistics. He has over 70 publications to his credit, which include books, book chapters, journal articles in the areas of language and linguistics. Additionally, he has published fiction in various journals, including 40 children's books. He has received grants and invitations to conferences from the Yale Council on African Studies. Actually, that's where we met some 6 years ago, as a panelist in talking about language and technology in Africa. Also Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, Danish Institute of Human Rights, Rosetta Stone in Virginia, Royal Wallen Institute in Sweden, among many others. Professor Mwangi is a leading translation and communication consultant who has made great strides in empowering the less educated by making critical information relevant and accessible. For instance, he led a group of experts in the translation of the standing orders of the National Assembly of Kenya, which earned him a special commendation by the Speaker of the National Assembly. He also consulted for the World Bank as the head of translation and Kiswahili communication for the US-Kenya Free Trade Agreement negotiations. He also undertook the same role during the Kenya-United Kingdom Trade Economic Partnership Agreement. He has also consulted for the United Nations, International Labour Organization, World Vision, the Red Cross Society of Kenya, and the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, among many other organizations. In 2012, he won the Global Translation Without Borders Empowerment Award. Professor Iribe is a renowned promoter of Kiswahili and African languages. He's a member of the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, the Global Association for Promoting Swahili, Chaukidu, where he serves as a board member, and the East African Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He sits on editorial boards of 4 international journals and serves as the Kiswahili external examiner for the University of Dar es Salaam, University of Zimbabwe, and Moi University. What brings us here is that in 2020, Professor Iribe and I were awarded a joint Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship, which seeks to have a mutually beneficial collaboration between the Department of Kiswahili, which he chairs, and the Department of African and African American Studies here at WashU. The ongoing research focuses on the mobility, linguistic adaptation, hybridity, and innovation among many groups of African immigrants who have resettled in Nairobi. Understanding that dynamic of language and how they adapt to new environment, and also in the passing of new information. I thank the African Initiative for helping sustain the ongoing research collaboration between the Department of Kiswahili at University of Nairobi and AFAS, and also thank the Department of Kiswahili and University of Nairobi for hosting me last summer. Please join me in welcoming this wonderful professor and great friend of mine, Professor Iribe Mwangi, to talk to us. Professor Iribe.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutonya. It is something. And I'm happy that we've been able to collaborate as the University of Nairobi and the University of Washington at St. Louis, and that we are doing quite some research together. As you've mentioned, we are doing a research. We are trying to do the language map of Nairobi and looking at the distribution of the languages that are spoken in the county of Nairobi. And I hope I'll have a minute to talk about that as I conclude. The other thing I would want to mention is that I know that the audience listening to us is not just comprised of linguists and language scholars, but it's a mixed audience. And as a result, I'll try to be as general as I possibly can, even as I speak about language issues. And because of that recognition and realization, I'll start by giving a review of the language situation in Africa. That's where I would want to start, so that we see where we are in terms of language and linguistics. But before I do that, let me just give you the title of my discussion today, Language as a Conveyor of Culture. We are looking at the case of borrowed vocabulary in Kiswahili. And in a short while, I'll discuss the words culture and borrowed that appear on that title to say exactly what it is that we will be looking at. Now, those are the maps I have mentioned. The first map, I am saying this is the perception that we have of the language situation in Africa, where we see Africa as divided between Anglophone speaking and maybe Franco speaking, as well as Arabic speaking countries or regions. But on the right, we have what I'm calling the reality. If you look at the first map, the perception is that the entire section marked red basically is English speaking. Blue is Francophone. We have pockets of Arabic and French, and the northern part is basically Arabic speaking with a few other languages in between. That is the perception that we have about Africa and language, but the reality is different. It's on the right. We realize that we have no issues on the northern part, the one that use Arabic, but on sub-Saharan Africa, we are talking of various languages, many of them. You can see that in the West Africa region, Mading and Hausa are large families. We have Chadian, Sudanese, Arabic to the north. We have Somali to the east. We have languages like Afrikaans and Guni in the south. And of course, our major focus is this section that uses Swahili. And this is the language that we will be monitoring this. It's evening here. It's in the morning in the US and the different hours in different places. Now, what then are the language families that are found in these regions? We have basically two major language families and two others. And the major one is this, Bantu. All this area is Bantu speaking, is what is also called Congo Cordovinian, this region. We do have Afro-Asiatic languages to the north. And we do have pockets of Nilo-Saharan, the ones marked green here, and I think red to the right. And we may not forget or want to forget the Khoisan to the southwest of Africa. Those are the basic language families that we have in Africa. Let's then move to Kenya. We have three major language groups in Kenya. We do have the Cushitic languages in the entire of this region, Nilotic languages, basically in what we call the Rift, and Bantu languages marked green, found in the coastal region of Kenya and the central Kenya, and pockets of it in the western region. Coming now to Swahili. In Africa, this is one of the countries where Kiswahili is spoken by basically almost everybody. And this country is Tanzania. Then we have Kenya and Uganda. You can see that the blue is deeper in those two countries. Then moving on to the central part of the continent, and again to the southeastern. So we are basically saying that Kiswahili is a language that is spoken in very many areas in Africa. It is spoken widely. Having said that, let's now move to to what I would call the introduction. And my introduction is based on a quote, a very popular quote by the distinguished Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a native of Kenya, who says that language, and in his case, any language has a dual character. It is both a means of communication and a carrier of culture. It's the last bit that concerns us, the bit to do with culture, because we are saying that every language conveys culture. And the aspects of culture that we are saying are passed from one language to another, that are conveyed by the language, are both tangible and intangible. And I'll come to that in a moment. So we are saying in our discussion here that borrowed words that are found in a language reflect the culture that a particular language speaking group has adopted. And we are saying that once those aspects are adopted by the language, they become part of that language. I have here a stool. This tool is an African stool, and in Kiswahili, we call it kigoda. Now, this tool does not only mean a seat. It is a stool that has some cultural content, cultural impact in it. It's not used by everyone. It's a stool that shows what we may call wisdom. Therefore, if a community or if a language borrows the name of this tool, it will borrow the tool together with the cultural content that goes with it. So this is what we are saying, that those borrowed items, lexical items, are basically words. They denote the cultures of those languages, and we are saying that those cultures are able to transcend geographical boundaries. They move from, say in our case, from Europe and Asia to Africa, in our case to the Swahili-speaking community. And what does this show? This shows that there is, through language, there is interconnectivity of regions because of the borrowings of culture and the use of language. And such interconnectivity is clear in this map. We see that some of these words and basically cultures moved from Europe all the way to the Swahili-speaking region in Africa. Some moved from Asia all the way to the Swahili-speaking areas. So we are saying the world is interconnected in terms of culture. The world is interconnected in terms of language. And basically, all these cultural exchanges can be found in the language, in the words that are used in the different languages. I don't want to go into this, it's more linguistics, but when we talk of loan words, we are talking of borrowing of linguistics. And I have a quote there by Ken Stowich and Suchato, who say that loan word adaptation is constraint and repair in real time. Repair, because once a word is borrowed, it's then repaired to resemble the sound system of the recipient language. Constraints, because the word needs to be constrained to look like the word that was actually borrowed. Again, something I don't want to get into detail about is the theoretical orientation of our presentation, but I believe that quote there by Langaka is very important because he observes that there is no language whose speakers have had any contact with other languages, or speakers of other languages is completely free of borrowed forms. So whenever 2 or 3 languages come into contact, then you will expect to get borrowed forms in those languages. And So in a way, it is a way to indicate borrowing in languages. It's a way to indicate contact, because unless a language comes into contact with some other language, then the borrowings may not occur. So we use in our presentation the theory of language in contact. I don't want to go into that, the origins of the theory. All I would want to mention is that any good language, any good theory on language should at least focus on the social and the psychological aspects of language. We do have a structure, we do have form of linguistic study that just looks at the structure of the language minus the users. And we are saying in this case, for us to understand the cultural aspect, then we have to include the society and its psychological aspects of the happenings. Of course, the theory is drawn from Edward Sapir, who earlier on talked about contact between languages, contact between communities, and indicated that whenever that happens, then there must be borrowings. And he's observed that those borrowings may be friendly or hostile. They may be forced onto a community. Of course, thinking about the culturally dominant languages, that once two languages meet, the one that is more dominant dominates against the other, and in a friendly or hostile way may make that language borrow some of its cultural aspects. Now, drawing from this linguistic consideration, we came up with our own thesis, and we are saying when there is a lexicon or vocabulary borrowing, which of course results from what we have just called language contact, then there always is a likelihood that the associated cultural practices and values may be borrowed too. So we are saying you do not just borrow words, you borrow words together with the cultural practices that go with those words. On the inverse, if you borrow some cultural practices, then they have to be accompanied by words or the language that will be used. Now, I talked of borrowed vocabulary or lexicon on tangible culture. And I said that in a moment I'll be discussing this. Tangible culture basically involves cultural heritage and items, products and objects that we use every day, that we see, and we will see quite a number of them as we continue. And in our presentation here, we are saying that there are many items of the tangible culture that came to Swahili-speaking nation from Europe and Asia. And we are saying that once they were borrowed, then they became part of the culture of the Kiswahili speakers. We are also saying that by use of language study, basically studying the morphology of the recipient language, in this case, Kiswahili, it is possible to see some of those aspects that were borrowed and that came into Kiswahili from geographically different regions. The first aspect we look at is the travel and technology, and I don't want to go deep into it. In Africa, the main mode of travel was on foot. We remember those caravans, slave caravans before that, and all the things that happened during them, during that period. However, with the advent of different modes of communication came different forms of vocabulary. And these new arrivals in terms of vocabulary can tell us which cultural products are foreign to Kiswahili. And we can see some of the borrowed words there from English in terms of travel modes. We have the bus, which basically in Kiswahili is basi, the eloprene, which is elopreni, and we have others that have been borrowed from languages like Indian, Persian, and even Arabic. We have those words there. I don't want to keep reading them. But this shows us that this is a mode of travel and transport that was foreign to Kiswahili speakers. And once this mode of transport was adopted by Kiswahili speakers, then it became part of their culture, so that gari, that is a vehicle, became part of their culture, part of what they do almost on a daily basis. And that word gives us that conceptualization. Then I will also talk about education. In pre-colonial times, Kenodia 2009 tells us there was what we call localized, relevant, indigenous knowledge. And we are saying this was informal education. Informal because there were no classrooms, there were no promotion of grades. We didn't have schools as we know them today. And therefore, every place was a classroom. And everybody who understood the community and who wanted to pass information about the community was a teacher. So that we did not have teachers as profession. We did not have teachers as professions. We did have everybody who understood the society, welfare of society, the culture of society was a teacher. And every place was a classroom. And this sort of education, as Smith observes, was surely and actually lifelong. It started from when a baby was born, and to death, they were still learning. But then formal education, in terms of learning, seems to have replaced the informal in a very great extent. And this is very obvious if you looked at the cultural items that are associated with education currently. Most of them are borrowed, meaning that this education culture too is borrowed. Looking at words like chalk, the alphabet, and even school itself, which in Kiswahili is skuli, all these are borrowings from English. And we have more and more of such borrowings from other languages. For example, we do have borrowings from German, Schule, very commonly used in Kenya, which basically is a school. We have others from Arabic, education, book, teacher, all those are borrowings. And therefore here we tend to agree with this myth that the borrowed form of education, which became part of the culture of the Swahili speakers, is hierarchical, it's structured, it's chronological, it's graded, and we have what we are now calling a system of education through which a pupil learns from the lower grades all the way to the universities. Now, some other cultural borrowings have to do with the status. And this status may be recognized from the titles. And most of the titles reflect a newly acquired cultural form of recognition. Take, for example, the word balozi in Kiswahili, which in English means an ambassador. This is a borrowing from Turkish. So basically showing that we may not have had a person who is seen as a representative of their society, in this case Kiswahili, in a different cultural setting. We have waziri, minister, president. These are some of the cultural acquisitions that the Swahilis may have acquired as a result of interaction with other communities. Let's note that we are talking about contact. And we understand that Swahili speakers really did come into contact with Arabs. They did come into contact with English speakers, Turkish speakers, and some of these came through, for example, other languages. It may be indirect contact. The Swahili speakers may not have had the need to have titles like the inspector and police, because everybody basically was an inspector and everybody was a police, policing their community. So some of these can be seen as foreign acquisitions. And that's why we are saying that culture may be borrowed, and these borrowings are very evident from the language and from vocabulary. Look again at the numbers and the counting. It is almost clear that the Swahili speakers did count, but did count from 1 to 9, as did many communities in Africa. And 10 happened to have been the largest of those numbers, and there was a way of conceptualizing it. But then in came new cultures with bigger numbers and a different way of seeing the world and counting and figures. And in came words like hamsini, which basically means 50 from Arabic, 1,000, elf, again from Arabic. And thinking of English, Kiswahili acquired milioni, which means a million. And from Indian, it acquired laki, which is 100,000. So the figures grew, and the way of looking at the figures became different. This can be looked at when we also move to games and sports. Karata, which now is common, game of cards from Portuguese, and all these other games from the cultural background of English speakers, golf, volleyball, soccer. If you looked at the words in Kiswahili, golfu, volleyball, soccer, they're all borrowings. And that tells us something. But let's now move to another field. This is the medical or health field and the terminologies they are in. The known modes of treatment were replaced with what you'd call modern methods, modern objects. And we can see these from the borrowings that we have, most of them from English, from where the modern medical practices were borrowed from. You have words all the way from the hospital itself, hospitality, to sirage and clinic. All those words indicate that this is a culture that did not exist. Not that Africans did not have their way of treating their sick, but the way they did it was so different that they did not have words, for example, say for a sirage. So when this sirage came to the Swahili speakers, they did borrow the word, they did borrow the item, and they did do what we said. They tried to modify the word to feed their sound system, and therefore sirage became siriji. Now, I want now to move to something what I'm calling extra out of our borrowing, and I want to speak about the change of treatment modes. And in my opinion, and this is from my study of this vocabulary related to medicine, the modern form of medicine was viewed with a lot of mistrust and suspicions by Swahili speakers. And I am saying this looking at the words that are used currently. For example, we are now talking of vaccinates and vaccines. And the word used in Swahili is dunga, dunga sidano. That is to inject or to vaccinate. But looking at the word dunga in Swahili, its origin means stab, as you'd stab a person using a sword. So if an injection, one has to be stabbed using an injection, that conjures a very violent form of an image. It doesn't show that it's something that brings healing. It's basically like something that brings pain, and injury. Look at the word surgery, because we didn't really have surgical equipment and everything to do with the surgery. It was different. The way it was done was very different. It was done, but it was in a very different manner. But when the new concepts came, surgery was basically translated to as upasuaji. Kupasua in literally means to split open. So if someone has to be split open in order to be healed, then again, that is a violent imagery. Or when we talk of extracting a tooth, kungoa, ngoa jino, basically and literally uproot. So as a result of this and many other words related to medicine, I am persuaded to believe that it was viewed with a lot of mistrust and suspicion, and that's why the vocabulary that was chosen to translate these terminologies does not seem very kind. And therefore, I would want us to leave that point with some food for thought. Could this also be a reflection of the manner in which early medical practitioners in Africa related with the population? What was the relationship between those early practitioners and the populace, the Swahili speakers in this case? That's something we may want to think about. And as I close this chapter on borrowing of medical terms, I would want to get to where we are at now after the advent of COVID-19. This brought with it massive borrowings because almost everything to do with the COVID-19 was new. It was a new phenomenon. It came with new words from English mostly, and Swahili had to cope and cope fast. We have words like virusi for virus. This word was there for a long time. Its use was not very, much spread, but I believe with the advent of COVID-19, everyone now knows virusi. The word curfew, it's again another borrowing from curfew. Quarantini from quarantine, and gloves are now glove in Swahili. These borrowings would clearly indicate, even in the future, that these were words that were not in the native Swahili vocabulary. I have another extra here to do with the COVID-19. We know it has had serious challenges, but I am looking at terminologies that have been commonly used, such as social distancing. How does this sit with the African and the Swahili cultural practices, for example? Africans are known for being socially very, very close. So once you use a word like social distance, or they are socially very close, what psychological effect does this have about the disease and the terminologies? Because when you are telling them to be socially distant from the folks, for example, then this does not seem very kind. And that explains why some of the words and some of the practices seem extremely foreign. We were thinking maybe some form of geographical distancing may sound better. Or think of the word like lockdown. what memory would a lockdown bring to African users? It reminds them of the colonial lockdowns, the gulags that were associated with colonialism. And this may have a lot of effect on not just the language itself, but the cultural understanding of the disease and preventive measures. As we move on, I would want to say that we have a lot of assorted items that are products and objects that indicate whatever they denote is foreign to Swahili culture. I have there some words from Persian, from Arabic, sugar, sukari, from Turkish and English, Indian, Kudi, and Portuguese, mvinho, that's wine. All these, we did have, for example, alcoholic drink and drinks among the Swahili speakers, but those drinks were not wine, okay? The concept of banking and money is foreign, and that clearly is evident from the borrowing of the word hundi from Indian, hudir. So all these seem to be items that were borrowed from foreign cultures. I started by saying that the borrowing can either be of tangible or intangible culture. I've been discussing the tangible part of it. On the intangible, we are here talking about things that only exist in our minds, things that only exist in society intellectually, like myths, oral poetry, superstitions, and any other beliefs. And here we again see words like kiyama, that is judgment, borrowed from Arabic. And this tells us that there is a high chance that this cultural practice of judgment after death may be a borrowed concept. We have others like Mass, Misa, which is borrowing from English, and Eucharisti, Eucharist. Clearly, these are borrowed aspects of intangible culture, which basically denote to the fact that this might have been foreign to the Swahili speakers. Something extra here. We've been emphasizing on borrowings from Europe and Asia, basically from far-flung geographical areas. But I want to emphasize that borrowings do not, to Swahili language, do not only come from those areas. Some are from African languages. Remember, we said that languages that are in contact do have this form of a relationship, which Sapir calls intercourse. We have words that have been borrowed from African languages, other African languages like Kiswahili, words like ikulu to denote state house, borrowed from Zanaki language in Tanzania, bunge, borrowed from Kinyamwezi for parliament, again from Tanzania. We have a word like harambe, which shows pulling together, borrowed from Mijikenda, a coastal language in Kenya. And we have a lot of research going on Sheng and its sister English. And basically this seems as like a modern non-formal variety of Swahili. And this variety houses very many African words to describe different things. So it has borrowed from, it has a Swahili basis, but it borrows not just from English, it has borrowed a lot from many African languages. Lastly, I can see my time is up, but as I said, I needed a minute to talk about that. Now, that is the ongoing research that my colleague and friend, Professor Mungai Mutonya, and I have been undertaking in Nairobi. We were doing some research from August on the ground. And we were trying to establish a linguistic map of Nairobi using a perceptual approach. And we basically have something which is down here. And in doing this, we were trying especially to look at the language use of the immigrants. COVID-19 did show us that the immigrants had a much bigger problem in terms of language use, language understanding, and mitigation measures in terms of COVID because of the understanding of the language. And as we try to map, we realized that we have many different established residents. And we also realized or established that most of the immigrants settled in areas according to where they have come from. So we have areas that have the Numbi from Sudan, the Shona from Zimbabwe, the Zulu, etc., etc. Most importantly to Kiswahili is that these people do use some form of Kiswahili. And there are words that may be more pronounced by the Nubians than the Somali speakers of the same language, okay? These residents, the six of these have been around for a long time, and they have been pretty well established. And even their forms of languages, Kiswahili included, are pretty well established. Thinking of people like the Shona, for example, these are clearly very well established. They've been around for long periods. I believe they have now even been made legally citizens of Kenya. But of course, Ethiopians are Kenyan neighbors, and the Ugandans, and because of their historical issues, they did settle in Kenya and have been around for a long time. But we also established that there are new, relatively new immigrants from Rwanda, from Burundi, from Zambia, and from South Sudan, again, because of the recent history of what has been happening to those countries. In conclusion, I would want to say that some aspects of European and Oriental cultures have been adapted by Kiswahili speakers. And after adapting them, they have become part of their way of life. They live them, they use them, and these are things that they do on a day-to-day basis. And they are a result of what we have called language contact. Through language contact, distant cultures have been connected to Kiswahili speakers and to the Swahili society, and they have acquired new cultural artifacts, new tangible cultures, and new intangible cultures. I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Iribe. That's quite fascinating. We have learned quite a lot. And I just wanted to throw in some questions from the audience, and I encourage the audience to continue sending in questions. And I think I'll start with the questions that come, two related questions. One is from Muya, who asks this question. He says that Chimamanda Adichie has a TED Talk, a very popular one called The Danger of a Single Story. And it speaks to the limits, deficiencies of the narratives that define Africa. And in the case of Kenya, asking, to what extent does linguistic mixing and the dominance of English constrain the stories that Kenyans share about themselves to the world? And I think related to that is another one that asks about the impact of borrowed words on identity, individual and societal identity. Maybe you can start with those ones and then we can go to another one after that.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutonya. Let me start with this one on a single story. I think this is the most dangerous thing that has happened about Africa. For a long time, we have had a single story. And once we have that, then it gets very hard for Africans and anyone for that matter to be heard. I started by showing the reality about African languages and the perception that has been perpetrated for a long time about the language map of Africa. This, I must say, limits to a very great extent the understanding of what happens where. And therefore, I would personally vouch for a way where we have a multi-pronged form of storytelling, where our story is told by others and where we also tell our own story. This way, Africa will be understood in a better way. That's how I would talk about that. Then the second question was on impact of borrowing and identity. Now, I think this is what one would call a catch-22 situation. Maybe one would want to have what you'd call a puritanic form of language, where you have a very pure language without borrowing. But then again, we ask ourselves, is this reality? Is it possible to have a language that is pure, especially at this age when we are we are becoming global, when we are becoming technologically and scientifically savvy? Would we develop if we wanted to be puritanic? That would be the question. And to answer that question, I would also say that every language in the world borrows. Actually, the language I'm using now, English, has borrowed more than any other language from languages like French, Italian, Greek, and any other language that, including Swahili, which I'm using. I have seen the Oxford 10th edition. We have words like mzee, which is basically a Swahili word, and many other Swahili words like shamba and others. So every language borrows, but does a language lose its identity? And do the language users lose their identity as a result of borrowing? I don't think so. I think borrowing enhances the language users and gives them a global outlook, and they are able to adopt to strategies and also have commodities, tools, and everything that will make them move forward with the world. But I do not think this has what you'd call a major impact on identity. Because if that were so, the English speakers would not have an identity, really.
Right then. I have two other questions that relate to borrowing. One from Nicholas Makanji. He says, wonderful presentation, Professor. And he asks, we have seen excessive borrowing established as an indicator of language endangerment. I'm wondering, from your encounter and research and establishment of the extent of borrowing in Kiswahili, could this borrowing be an indicator of a threat to Kiswahili? Could it endanger Kiswahili? And related to that, Carolina Sorgo says, is the fact that Swahili is a lingua franca in the region make it more likely to have loan words? Also, how do you compare the effort to create Kiswahili vocabulary rather than used borrowed words?
I am happy to hear those questions. I would say very well thought questions from some of the people I can recognize. Some of them are my students. Does borrowing denote a danger to Kiswahili? Now, I think in a way I answered that question. I do not see borrowing endangering Kiswahili or reading to the death of Kiswahili. I see borrowing do what I mentioned earlier, leading to language growth. Growth, in a way, does not mean death. It means expanding its horizons. Of course, I know we can compare, say, a human being. Once they grow old, they are facing death. But I also know languages grow before they die. But I think as of now, I do not see any danger in Kiswahili, because what happens is not that words are replaced. The words that exist in Kiswahili are not replaced in a very robust manner, for example, especially when we deal with things that have always existed. In my opinion, the borrowings come in with the new cultures. And that leads me to the second question, whether there are any other forms of forming words other than borrowing, and whether those would be better methods. I would want to say that word formation processes are many. We are very, very many. And borrowing is just one of them. And maybe what we may want to do is to see the percentage of these new creations. For example, if we looked at the new words that have been formed in Kiswahili in the last 2 decades, how many of them are borrowings, okay? And how many have been formed using other forms of word formation, because there are many forms there. It's not just borrowing. And lastly, there was the question whether Kiswahili being a lingua franca really portrays its borrowing. I think they are saying that it borrows a lot because it's a lingua franca. I think I would agree with that because there are a lot of things that we need to say in Kiswahili, which we may not have use or need of saying in other native languages. So being a language that is used as lingua franca, and actually a global language because Kiswahili is global, then it has to keep up with the global developments. And therefore, yes, I think this affects the extent it borrows.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think there are so many questions. Unfortunately, we are running short of time. So I want to thank you a lot and throw this back to Janet. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Professor Uribe, Professor Munge. Fantastic discussion. And honestly, I think the audience could have kept us here for another hour as they so generously shared their questions and their own experiences. This has been just a fantastic program. It's been our honor to host you and to celebrate the collaboration between you. And with this, we will bring our program to a close. Audience, please join me in thanking Professor Uribe for this presentation, for joining us today. Much applause. And everyone, please have a healthy and safe rest of your day, or a good evening to you if that applies. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today.